Okay, so have you ever felt that like math is just this like a world of just symbols and it's like kind of coded and, maybe it's not really for you?
Hmm.
Well, what if I told you that like the very foundation of algebra, this thing that we often see as like this big puzzle of X's and Y's, was actually originally written in plain sentences?
Oh,
Really? Yeah, over 1,000 years ago.
wow.
That little fact we think holds like a really powerful key to making math accessible to absolutely everyone.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
We're about to really kind of explore math, not as this like fixed set of rules that's just handed down,
Right.
but it's something that's really human and so inclusive and like fundamentally connected to all the diverse ways our brains make sense of the world.
Yeah. And in this deep dive, our guide is Dr. Jaime Hoerricks.
Okay.
We're going to look at their journey in writing this new math textbook. It's
Wow.
called The Story of Math. And this isn't just a new set of exercises or anything.
All right.
It's a whole new way of looking at how we teach and understand math.
And what's really interesting here is that Dr. Horrocks' work on this book, The Story of Math,
Yeah.
isn't just theoretical.
Yeah.
It comes from these very real challenges that they saw in how math is currently taught.
And that's what I think will be really fascinating for our listeners today.
Absolutely.
If you've ever felt lost in a math class or you've wondered, like, where did these ideas even come from?
Yeah.
Or just wish there was, like, a more intuitive way to understand it, all this deep dive is really for you.
That's right.
We're going to be looking at why current math education might not be working for a lot of people and explore an alternative that puts story and clear language right at the center.
So for this deep dive, our main source is going to be an excerpt from Dr. Hoerricks' own writing
Okay.
about creating the story of math.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very personal reflection.
Yeah.
It really gives us a window into the problems they see with existing math materials and the inspiration behind this very different approach they're taking.
So let's get straight into it. What was that core issue, that kind of breaking point? What started this whole journey for Dr. Hoerricks?
It all comes down to this, seemingly simple comment from the principal. The principal said, there are no good learning centers. And Dr. Hoerricks explains that this wasn't about the classrooms themselves.
Right.
It was about the curriculum materials, the textbooks, the activities, the way math was presented. That statement,
Yeah.
really highlighted a huge gap in the resources that are available to actually support diverse learners.
And this wasn't just a general feeling of, oh, this isn't ideal.
Right.
It was having an actual impact on certain students.
Exactly. Dr. Hoerricks really emphasizes these very real struggles faced by students with IEPs, for example.
Yeah.
For whom a curriculum that's geared toward a single learning style can often feel completely inaccessible.
Totally.
And then you also have multilingual learners who are not only trying to decode these math concepts,
Right.
but they're doing it in a language that they're still mastering. And then tragically, there are many students who have developed this thing called learned helplessness in math,
Oh, yeah.
where they've come to believe that they just can't do math at all, regardless of their actual abilities.
And it sounds like Dr. Hoerricks saw this worrying trend
Yes.
in how curriculums are being developed to address these challenges.
Yes, exactly. The excerpt talks about what Dr. Hoerricks calls a race to the bottom in curriculum development. And the focus, it seems, has become more and more about stripping down the content to the bare minimum, often under this guise of accessibility.
Right.
But at the same time, there's this huge focus on aligning with standardized tests.
Which, as Dr. Hoerricks points out, aren't always the best measure of learning.
Exactly. And this big reliance on standardized tests has led to a situation where textbooks and teaching methods are often designed around achieving certain test scores, rather than actually fostering a deep understanding of the concepts. And in this push to meet those testing demands, the diverse needs of students with disabilities and multilingual learners can often be marginalized
Yeah.
or even ignored.
Yeah, they become secondary considerations
That's-
instead of being central
That's right.
to how we design the learning.
Exactly.
So it's almost like we're catering to one type of learner,
Right.
and everyone else has to fit into that mold.
Yeah, that's a really crucial insight.
Yeah.
Dr. Hoerricks introduces this powerful idea of the neuromajority, kind of unintentionally creating systems that just don't work for everyone.
Yeah.
And then you have neurodivergent educators like them working really hard to try to patch things together
Right.
and find these alternative ways to serve their diverse students.
So Dr. Hoerricks saw this systemic issue. They
Yes.
saw this lack of resources, and they felt the need to find a different path.
Yeah.
And that's when they turned to a source of inspiration that I think might surprise a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. In their search for a more inclusive and effective approach, they were really drawn to a book
Okay.
that was written over 1,000 years ago
Mhm.
by a scholar in Baghdad during this just like amazing period of intellectual flourishing.
Wow.
And the book was called The Compendious Book on Calculation by Completion and Balancing,
Okay.
written by Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwārizmī.
Al-Khwārizmī, a name that, I think a lot of people might recognize as being important in the history of math.
Yeah.
But can you kind of paint a picture of who he was and the world that he lived in for us?
Well, you have to imagine Baghdad in the 9th century during the Abbasid Caliphate. This wasn't, the image of conflict that we so often see today.
Right.
This was a thriving center of learning and innovation. A city filled with beautiful gardens and bustling libraries.
Wow.
And there was this real energy around the exchange of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And at its heart was this incredible institution called the House of Wisdom, the Beit al-Khwārizmī.
Okay.
And this wasn't just a library, it was a really dynamic hub.
Right.
Where scholars from diverse backgrounds came together to, translate and preserve and build upon knowledge from across the world. So you had people working with Arabic, Greek, Syriac, Persian, Sanskrit. It was incredible.
So it's this real melting pot of ideas.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
al-Khwārizmī was like a central figure in this environment. He wasn't working in isolation. He was part of this huge collaborative effort. And his genius was in his ability to synthesize these diverse ideas to make them clearer, more systematic,
Yeah.
and crucially more accessible and useful to a wider audience.
And this really connects to how he chose to write this book.
Yes.
That became so important in math.
Exactly. Around 820 CE, he wrote the Compendious Book on Calculation by Completion and Balancing, which was significantly the first text to systematically present algebra as a general method for solving problems. And in fact, the word algebra that we use today actually comes from the Arabic word al-jab in the book's title, which refers to this operation of restoration. So essentially, it's balancing equations by adding the same quantity to both sides.
Yeah.
It seems simple, but it's such a powerful idea.
And here's this little detail that I think is really fascinating.
Yeah.
And it's what caught Dr. Hoerricks' attention, and it caught mine too. This foundational text of algebra wasn't actually written using symbols.
That's right. Al-Khwārizmī wrote the whole book in words, full sentences.
Wow.
There were no X's, no plus or equal signs. There was no mathematical shorthand at all. This is what's called rhetorical algebra.
Okay.
Every equation, every operation was described in plain everyday language so that anybody who understood numbers in Arabic could follow along and understand.
It's so hard for me to picture algebra without symbols.
No.
They just seem so central to it now.
Right.
Can you give us a quick example of what this would have looked like? How would al-Khwārizmī have written a simple algebraic equation using this style?
Sure. So let's take a very simple equation like x5 plus 10x equals 39. Al-Khwārizmī would have expressed this as a square and 10 roots are equal to 39.
See, it's so direct. It's almost like you're telling a story with the math.
Yeah.
And Dr. Hoerricks makes this really interesting argument
Yes.
that this choice to use words wasn't some kind of, primitive limitation.
Right.
It was actually a deliberate choice.
It absolutely was.
So why did al-Khwārizmī choose to do this?
Well, the main reason seems to be inclusivity and accessibility.
Okay.
By using full sentences and avoiding abstract symbols, he made math accessible to a lot more people, not just the intellectual elite.
Right.
So you had merchants who needed to calculate profits, surveyors who needed to measure land, scribes who worked with financial records.
Right.
All these people who relied on math in their daily lives could understand and use his methods.
It was making math practical for everyone.
Exactly. It was about democratizing mathematical knowledge and making it relevant to the real world.
So this challenges the common narrative.
Yeah.
That this way of doing algebra was just like a rudimentary step on the way to our modern way.
Exactly. It wasn't primitive at all. It was actually a very sophisticated decision that prioritized clarity. And it made the logic of math visible through language. In this way, math becomes something that you can explain,
Yeah.
something you can write out, something where the reasoning unfolds like a story,
Right.
making it so much more accessible to so many more learners.
And this focus on narrative and clear language seems like it would be really helpful to a lot of diverse learners.
Absolutely. Dr. Hoerricks really emphasizes how the narrative structure of this type of math
Mm-hmm.
can be beneficial for students who process information in different ways. This includes English language learners who benefit from the explicit contextual language.
Right.
It also provides scaffolding for students with working memory challenges, since the sentence structure gives them more anchors.
Makes sense.
And, it's less to hold in their minds than all these symbols
Yeah.
than there are students who struggle with symbolic reasoning. Right. For them, the direct language helps them bypass the need to decode all those abstract symbols,
Yeah.
so they can just focus on the relationships between the numbers.
Right.
And even for individuals who are autistic Gestalt processors,
Mm-hmm.
the narrative flow gives them a sense of continuity
Yeah.
and makes the math feel less like a bunch of disconnected, confusing pieces.
So it becomes less about like cracking this code.
Right.
And more about understanding the concept.
Exactly. It's not about, weeding people out who can't understand the symbols.
Right.
Instead, it's like, hey, you're capable of understanding this.
Yeah.
Let me show you how,
Yeah.
using language that we can all access.
And Dr. Hoerricks' own experiences working with students really solidified this belief in this approach.
That's right. Their work in a learning center with secondary students who had really struggled in mainstream classrooms was really important. These students often had what Dr. Hoerricks describes as spiky learning profiles. They showed strengths in some areas, like visual memory or spoken language reasoning.
Okay.
But then they had challenges in other areas,
Right.
like symbolic processing or written math fluency.
So they weren't lacking in intelligence. They just learned in different ways.
Exactly. And to connect with these students and teach them effectively, Dr. Hoerricks naturally started using methods that mirrored this rhetorical algebra.
Okay.
So they would rephrase math problems as sentences and narrate the steps out loud like a story,
Right.
and frame the math concepts in this really clear linguistic context.
Yeah, there's this example they give of rephrasing.
Yes.
A square and 10 roots are equal to 39. They rephrase that as there's a number, and when we square it and add 10 of that same number, we get 39. What might that number be?
That's right.
And it's so interesting because it's not the quickest or most efficient way to express that idea, but it immediately makes it so much more understandable.
Absolutely. It lets students engage with the core idea in a way that just feels more intuitive.
Yeah. Less abstract. It prioritizes meaning before speed.
And so this is what sparked the creation of the story of math.
Exactly. Dr. Hoerricks saw that these methods worked, but they were scattered.
Right.
So the story of math was a way to consolidate all these approaches
Okay.
into a structured resource. Not necessarily to replace the standard curriculum, but to offer a different path
Right.
for a wider range of learners.
So can you walk us through some of the key features and that overarching philosophy behind the book?
Well, the book is designed to cover a lot of material from basic arithmetic all the way through calculus, but it moves away from that linear hierarchical structure that you see in so many textbooks.
Right.
Each unit begins with a story.
Right.
It could be historical or cultural or about some practical application.
Right.
And this gives context to the mathematical concepts being explored in the unit.
And are these stories all from one specific place or time?
Not at all. That's a really important part of the book. Dr. Hoerricks really wants to decenter this Eurocentric view of math.
So they intentionally draw on all these different cultures and historical figures. The Babylonians, the Mayans, Chinese scholars, Arab mathematicians like al-Khwārizmī,
Right.
and various indigenous knowledge systems. It highlights that math is a global and multifaceted thing.
It's a human endeavor.
Exactly. Not just a Western invention.
And I found that learning structure that's used throughout the book really interesting.
It says eti. I say emsoe.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that structure is designed to build both basic communication skills and the more complex academic language skills that are essential for deep learning.
Okay.
So it encourages students to first identify the information.
Right.
It says S.
Yeah.
And then they share their understanding.
I see.
Exactly.
It's
And then they explain the implications.
That's so
Right. And this process helps with comprehension, especially for multilingual learners,
It makes sense.
because it supports developing fluency in math across different languages. Yeah.
And it seems like the book is aiming to be this more inclusive successor to those basic maths classes.
Right, which often carry a stigma.
Yeah.
Dr. Hoerricks says that the book is built on dignity
Hmm.
and belief in the potential of all learners.
Hmm.
It meets students where they are,
Right.
but it doesn't lower expectations.
Yeah.
It reframes the content.
And it makes it accessible.
Exactly.
So this challenges the whole idea that math is this purely modern Western invention.
Absolutely. Dr. Hoerricks really challenges that myth that we see in Western education. It erases this huge history of mathematical thinking
Right.
from other parts of the world
Yeah.
and throughout time. And treating abstraction as like the best math has really created this Eurocentric narrative that keeps people out instead of bringing them in.
And in this view, rhetorical algebra is not this old method that we need to forget.
No, it's a valuable tool.
It's accessible. It's clear. And it's rooted in practical stuff. And if you look beyond these traditional Western textbooks, you see this kind of mathematical thinking everywhere. The Inca system, the Babylonian base 60 system, ancient astronomical calculators like Uriel's machine, the Mayan pyramids.
Yeah.
These are all examples of advanced math, but they're often overlooked in Western curricula.
It's so interesting. So why have certain types of math been privileged over others?
That's what Dr. Hoerricks is getting at.
Yeah.
They see the story of math as a way to reclaim what's been lost.
Right.
When math was separated from meaning, culture, and purpose, it's about reconnecting with ancestral intelligence. The kind that doesn't see these divisions between math and other subjects.
The message this sends is really powerful.
It is. It's a message of inclusion.
Yeah.
It's like, there's a place for you here in math.
Right.
Your way of thinking is valid. Your ancestors were doing math long before it was even called that. So as we start wrapping up, what's that one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
Math is fundamentally human. It has this long and diverse history. There are many ways to understand it. We need to prioritize understanding over just memorizing symbols and doing calculations quickly. If we look back at historical methods like rhetorical algebra and embrace storytelling, we can create a more inclusive and meaningful way for everyone to connect with math.
It makes you think about, the stories we tell in education.
Yeah.
Who's being left out, especially in math, which is often presented as this objective truth that has nothing to do with culture or language.
It is. It challenges us to think about math in all its forms,
Yeah.
not just the narrow definition that we're often given.
And Dr. Hoerricks invites everyone to be part of this.
Yeah.
Educators, but also anyone who helps others understand math, to rethink these assumptions
Yeah.
and create more human-centered learning.
It's a call for collaboration to make math more engaging for all learners.
So as we come to a close, here's a final thought. Dr. Hoerricks is fascinated by al-Khwārizmī,
Yeah.
who chose clarity over abstract complexity. What if we could unlock new ways of understanding by looking at these different historical approaches? Maybe the best way to move forward in math is to really look back